Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 47 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt Bennett. I'm here with Curt and our special guest today, Dr. Allison Sampson-Jackson, who I'm thrilled to have with us. So I want to just before I introduce our guest, just get a few things out of the way here. One, this really is our second episode focusing, even though a lot of our episodes talk about resiliency. It's our second one really focusing hard on this with an expert from the outside. But you might want to check out episode 38 as well, when I thought had a really good episode called Rethinking Resiliency. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that with Allison today as well. Just a few other things. I'm wearing a piece of swag today. I think I mentioned before, if you send me swag, I will wear it on the episode and give you some free publicity. So this was given to me by my friends from the Hawaii Primary Care Association when I had to force to do a training in Honolulu earlier a few months ago. And just, I liked it so much I even bought my wife one. This is their active living movement. So send me swag. I'll wear it on the show, give it free prep here. Also, just want to throw out for our listeners, I've had a lot of requests of people asking me, can I just come to one of your trainings? And usually I have to say no because I'm always doing things for specific organizations or systems of care. And I'm excited to announce that in September 21st or 20th and 21st in Denver, Colorado, I'm partnering with the Human Services Network of Colorado to put on a 2-day Connecting Paradigms training, which we're really going to focus on the skills to help people with trauma look at and manage big life changes. So finally, after all these years of people asking me, hey, can I just come to one of your trainings? There's one coming up in September. I'll put the link on the show notes. And hey, and even if you're from out of town, September is a great time to come to Colorado. So usually Denver's perfect that time of year. And then our trees start changing up in the mountains too. So, come Thursday and Friday, you can come to my training. Then you can spend the weekend up in the mountains. So plan your vacation / professional development now. So and again, all that will be online. And so I want to dive into our topic today. And Allison and I met in Iowa at the Airport Holiday Inn in Des Moines, where so many past presidents have spoken, I believe. You just walk around Des Moines and you just, you see primary season all over the place. But we were with our good friend Holly Hansen and the public health folks there asked to, co-keynote together and got to connect over a call and then over a quick breakfast. And I think for both of us, hopefully you too, Allison, it just seemed like this is not enough time for us to have all the potential conversations that we could have. And so we went on to deliver, I think, probably the greatest keynote speech in the history of keynote speeches.
Totally agree.
And what really impressed me about Allison was not only her real brilliance around trauma and resiliency, but also a passion that she brings. I think both intellectually, but also from her personal story as well. And I think it was just a great mix of material and energy, and really enjoyed all my friends in Iowa. And I got to sit through a 90-minute workshop of hers as well and learned a lot too. So Allison, welcome. And we usually start out with a bright, shiny object of the week, just something we're kind of thinking about. So I'd love it if you gave a little bit more of a formal introduction of yourself and just something that you're kind of thinking about this week.
Sure, absolutely.
Kind of makes you the bright, shiny object.
What's that?
It kind of makes Allison the bright, shiny object.
Curt knows what my bright, shiny object is this week. He doesn't want me to say it. So this is all a stall tactic, Allison. It's going to happen. Curt can't stop it. You should know better.
I'm going to pretend it's about me. So, well, thank you for the kind introduction. It was a great breakfast, a great opportunity. I get super excited to meet people passionate in the same area as me, and I definitely think that's what we had. So I kind of suck at formal introductions, so I'm going to give it a shot. So I guess formally I'm Dr. Allison Jackson, right? And I have my bachelor's, master's, and PhD in social work. Not because I couldn't go into another field, but I really do like social work. And I did them all at the Virginia Commonwealth University. My passion the whole time is working with vulnerable populations, often living in vulnerable situations, often not in the most equitable situations. That's just really my passion. My other passion is the kid that's throwing a chair and cursing me out in the room. It's my favorite kid, so people can judge me for my mental health. But that was really my passion. And so throughout my career there, worked in juvenile detention, child protective services, went on after my master's and spent 20 years in clinical practice, really working everywhere from detention to residential hospitals, and then getting into community work. So I'm like, wow, what if we could do things in the world and keep people out of these locked-in places, and that's part of my personal story. So it's a personal passion as well, and maybe I'll get a chance to share more of that later. But I'm definitely a person that lived through trauma as a teenager, bumped in and out of residential facilities, and kind of had an opportunity from the inside to think about what helped me and what hurt me and how I could take that knowledge away. So, and then plan to never, ever go back to school and be a clinician forever. And then got really angry at systems in my 20 years and was like, this is not okay. And then supervisors were like, well, you can't just criticize it. You got to do something about it. And so a little girl that was 7 years old that had a lot of trauma, her case really inspired me to go back and get my dissertation in trauma and neuroscience and attachment, and really trying to think about how do we actually teach people in a way that leads to actual system change and practice change. So, so that's a long version. Short version is I've been known around the country as the trauma lady. I'm trying to rebrand as the resilience lady because the reason I care about trauma is because I care about resilience. So that would be probably my best formal introduction. My bright, shiny object, I'm feeling the pressure, but the thing that I'm thinking about the most is it's August, and in here in Virginia where I live, a lot of school trainings are happening for me. Schools thinking about kicking off their year. So I've been doing a lot of convocation speeches, and there's a really cool video out there that a principal in an elementary school in Nashville, Tennessee is talking about being a trauma-informed school. It's a really cool video. Maybe I can get Matt to put it up, but there's a moment, yeah, it's really cool just to go inside and they teach the kids the these are like 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds that are learning the 7 habits of being highly successful, highly effective. And they had this place where in the back room, they had a peace corner. And these kids, when they start to have feelings about stress, they actually at like 5, 6, and 7 years old go in the back in this beautiful peace corner and do aromatherapy and like think about their life and write about their feelings. And I'm like, oh my gosh, if I could freaking do that at 5. So I'm like trying to figure out how to put a peace corner in my house, a peace corner at all my trainings. Like I'm really thinking about the peace corner.
Very cool. Very cool. And I it's great to see more and more how schools and districts are looking at this. I'm next week back in Fountain Fort Carson training their new teachers because they've about trained, they've got maybe a couple left, but I was able to work with all their schools last year in the district and their administrators, and it's just so cool to see schools really taking not just a quick dive into this, but I think they are starting to see this as how they need to operate from moving forward. And that's an incredible place to be with this paradigm shift.
And if I can like steal like 2 more minutes, the other cool thing when you're just talking, because it's a deeper dive, but the other thing I have a passion about, and probably the only clinical work I still do, is I work 2 nights a week in a jail, and I work with women and men that are addicted to heroin and fentanyl and different types of substance addiction. So last night I was talking about working in the schools, and I showed them this school in the Peace Corner. And these are folks who've been like in the criminal justice system for 30 years. And many times I'm the first person that's ever introduced trauma. And they looked at this school and these big guys were like tearing up. Like, what if I had gone to my school? Like, what could have happened in my life? And then they got really like, we need to talk to the governor. We need to like make, like, it was really cool to watch, you know, some sadness that they didn't get that in their life, but they're passionate about this whole next generation health stuff. So it's pretty cool. It's exciting.
Absolutely. And incredibly empowering for folks to learn about themselves in this light, too. Even though, again, they may have been through more hardships than we would like them to be at that point. It's never too late to learn about yourself. And I think there's something amazingly freeing about that as well.
That's it. So long, bright, shiny object, but that's fine.
Very cool. Well, welcome to the podcast.
That's 3. That's not bad. That's not bad. That's really good.
Curt, what's your bright, shiny object of the week?
Oh, I was thinking about, Allison, what you were saying about being passionate about working with vulnerable populations. And I have the distinct opportunity to work with what I think is one of the most vulnerable populations, and that's people with intellectual disabilities who are traumatized.
Oh, wow.
I'm just diving into that now over the last couple of months, and really having a very good time designing systems around these people, and had this great experience where I was helping some of our clinical team learn about gathering information systematically and being kind of a hunter of information, trying to find new information. And we kind of peeled some layers back on this one case and found, I mean, amazingly, this young man who's placed in services he's in like adult foster care kind of home. And we looked at a lot of his psychological reports from way back in his early childhood, and found that this is not his first name. He had a different name and a different family. And I mean, we went all the way back, and suddenly people were looking at him entirely differently. The shift that you saw of people, you know, talking about some of the symptoms that he's exhibiting now: substance use, violence, aggression. I mean, there's a lot of symptoms that you would not be surprised about. And then when you look at his history, everybody's kind of like, oh, we got to do a better job for this guy. Like, this has just been a disservice over, you know, this many years of this young man's life. And that's a real bright, shiny object, to go through that kind of an experience and see people and groups of people have a complete 180 in how they think and how they are actually had the experience of being with him is now different for people. Right. And that's really fun to do. And of course, I like to, being a behavior analyst, I like to operationalize everything. And that's kind of like my hidden superpower. I can do that with almost anything. And so I'm putting, processes into place to produce that kind of experience more frequently. So having a workflow where people go through that process so that they can come to that kind of an experience a little bit with some more predictability is kind of what I do. And it's just fun to see that work. So a great, bright, shiny object from the last week.
Very cool. I'll make mine kind of quick here, but it's something I've definitely been fascinated with lately. And it comes from a book that I'm reading. And the book's more my bright, shiny object, but there's a definitely not so bright and shiny object that I found in this book. And it's The Biological Mind by Alan Janisoff. And I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that last name. But it's a really good book. And it's one of those, a lot of books when you talk about, and I'm not going to get into this topic too much, but the brain-mind duality. It's hard to find a book. I think it's such an important thing. It'll probably be something we talk about on a podcast at some point. An important concept, but often gets incredibly complex. very quickly. And the biological mind actually does a really nice job of getting to the complexity without, on a very accessible level, and from a lot of different perspectives. So I'll put a link to it on the show notes as well. But one of the things I learned in this book that has blown my mind this week is the concept of fecal implants. And we've kind of mentioned this. Curt hasn't logged out yet, so we're good. Mentioned this, but there's a lot of research now on the gut. And a lot of people are now calling the gut the second brain. And I'm building a little bit of expertise on this, but it's like I'm still trying to somewhat talk about the brain in a way for folks that I do trainings with in my writing. But there's a lot of complexity there, and they're finding out with these fecal transplants, if you transplant healthy gut bacteria from a healthy person into somebody who's struggling with disease or mental health issues, that a lot of times their symptoms improve. Now, how you become a fecal donor, I don't know, but I'm vegan, I'm healthy, I make my own kombucha, eat a lot of sauerkraut. So, I'm not sure how you sign up for this, but I think I'm a good donor for this. I'm also a big guy too, which might help. I don't know, maybe this is my new calling. So if I figure out how to be this, I'll add a page to my website. But I think, again, when we talk about all the complexities of the brain and neurobiology and trauma and resiliency, I think one of the things we're going to be talking more and more about is diet as part of not just our physical health, but also our mental health as well. And Allison, I know with my work in the systems, if you really want to be appalled, go, and not every place, but go to a residential facility at lunchtime. And I've seen people eat the worst kind of corn dogs, because you just can't cook 250 corn dogs at one time.
In a good way.
There's one good corn dog. If you get the one right in the middle, everything else is still frozen or burnt. And we often put the worst sort of food in the stomachs of the people that could really use the healthiest of food. So, just a fecal transplants is my bright, shiny object of the week.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah, so there you go. Look for my new website coming soon. So Allison, we'll get away from fecal matter and
that works. We'll go back to the other side of the body. Yeah, that works.
Exactly. And I just kind of like for you to share with our audience, as somebody who's been thinking and now doing a lot of talking and working around the trauma-informed paradigm and that movement, I just a little bit about sort of what fuels your passion. What is it about this topic and all the related topics to it, including resiliency that we'll get into, that sort of drew you in and keeps you very passionate about the work that you do?
Yeah, so and I'll trust the two of you to keep me as concise as I might need to be, but two things come up for me with that question. So I guess the first was going back to that 7-year-old clinical case. I so respect what Curt you talked about. Sometimes one case and really diving into it can change you. So this little girl had been sexually abused by 8 members of her family and then removed. And I met her. She had reactive attachment disorder. Was in her 8th foster care placement when I met her at 7. And she had just finished doing $4,000 of damage to that particular house. And just meeting this little girl, and nothing we were doing was working. And clinically, I don't have the skill set of ABA, have a huge appreciation of, but diving into it and literally, hopefully coming from a good clinical background of knowing when to say, I have no, and I'll keep it clean here, freaking idea what to do. Like, I'm lost. So I'm lost. And we literally drove up to an attachment clinic up in DC, and it was my first time of being exposed to trauma work. And I was like, God, how do I go through all this education? I've never heard of trauma work. And then I'm like, this is what I do. This is what I've been feeding. And so that really like ignited my passion. And we tried things with her. She'd been kicked out of her school, everything. And we started trying new things. And I did intensive in-home with her. So our team was with her 80 hours a week. Trying to just keep her out of residential facilities to really, and I remember walking with her one day and she said, you know what, I'm like Gaddafi. So this is a 7-year-old telling me she's like a terrorist. And she's like, I can't get close to you because I'll destroy you. And it just, the transformation of her being able to attach to a family just was like, okay, I need to learn this. I have been robbed, and so is our community, of not knowing about this health issue. The other thing that happened in that was my personal story. So it took me back, something I actually hid for a long time professionally, because I came from this place of professional dissidence. We don't talk about that, right? I did a lot of work in therapy, but I'm not going to talk about that professionally because they'll take away all my credentials. And, but I was a kid, as I mentioned, that was in and out of residentials a lot, between like 10 and probably 19, like 10 times. And so you talk about that food, like I was a kid put in 4-point restraints, injected with Thorazine. I remember a nurse saying, you need to act your age, not your shoe size. You won't get out of here unless you come through me. I own you, just in case the audience is wondering, that is not trauma informed. But I think it's the best she knew 30 years ago. And so that lived experience, and the short version, if you want more, you could watch my TED Talk. But the person that was the first transformational person in my life was a man named Howard, with no letters behind his name, because I don't believe it takes letters to connect with a human being. You can be therapeutic without being a clinician or a therapist. We have that possibility in us. And he just took the time to relate to me. And I didn't know it then, but what he was doing was trauma-informed care. He was building a relationship. He was teaching me self-regulation skills. He was building my identity. He was telling me that there was resilience in me and I had a choice. And I think I go backwards, but that moment with that client brought all that up in me. And then I was like, why aren't people being taught about this? And that's what, led me into teaching clients and families, and then later systems. So that's really my story. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. And, I think that it's so important, to hear that lived experience too. And I agree with you. It's kind of that, in graduate school, I was so beat over the head that you never share anything about you. No self-disclosure whatsoever. And, that got ingrained into my personality so much. But there's such, I think as we think about resiliency, what keeps us in this field oftentimes is our lived experience. And I think that can sometimes put us at risk of vicarious or secondary trauma, but is also the source of such great strength as well.
Absolutely. And I think it's not, I used to hold it just for us clinicians, but again, as we've mentioned, it's teacher time right now for me. And just to watch the teachers that have been so beat up on it, at least us three kind of know we were going in to work with problems. We had a little bit of an inkling. Yeah. And you're watching teachers who really thought they were going to walk in a classroom where there were brains ready to learn, to do the lesson plan they thought they were going to teach. And then watching what's happening. And so as much time as we spend with, man, I care about these kids, my passion has become about the staff and the wellness of, because they do have their own ACE scores. So, we know 90% of the people in the helping field have that. But do they have the time to build resilience? Do they have the time for themselves? Because, many of us, we didn't go in this for the money, or we were madly misdirected. Yeah. Yes. So, right, we got really bad info. But yeah, I just, to say your part, like it is. And so how do we then, of course, walk the balance? I think the peer recovery movement's trying to do that right now, which I've got a lot of involvement in. But how do you walk that balance of being able to hear you and not let you take on my stuff, but also the value of what I've lived to you?
Awesome.
I noticed, Allison, one of the things that you do is some leadership development.
Yeah.
So that kind of piqued my interest. I love doing that kind of thing. And I'm often stricken in organizations, in teams, and in systems, how the drive towards organizational and system level hyperarousal is so prevalent. And it's so hard, even at the kind of the micro level of a leader of a team, to be able to hold the drive to go towards risk aversion and to help your team to always think about creativity.
Yes.
Think about what are those little differences in clinical work are usually not 180-degree changes.
Yeah.
They're 10-degree changes, right? Like they're very small things.
Yeah.
And over time, those very small things become much bigger.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what your experience is going. Does it mirror some of that?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked me that question. So again, part of my journey, right? So then I go into the system work, and then I'm like, God, oh my God, I'm not qualified. I mean, I've been a leader, but many of us who are clinicians, we were good clinicians, and then one day someone said, hey, you should be a leader.
Yeah, and it's like, not the same job.
It's not the same thing, you know? Like, so I did that well. I don't know how to maybe teach that well. So I think that.
But you can do therapy with anybody.
Yeah,
so that's what I did. I just started doing therapy with my staff.
Yeah. I remember writing my first budget on a napkin going, I don't remember taking accounting in the MSW program. I'm so not qualified, but I better not tell anyone. So, but yeah, so I think when you ask the question, then what started happening is I missed the part in the beginning of like, I started doing all this trauma teaching and thinking my clinical experience would take me there, but it's not any different than any other initiative in leadership. If the leadership's not ready, it doesn't matter what I'm bringing. So that's what led me. And then I was like, oh my gosh, there is the parallel, right, of the hyperarousal. And so what I got interested in is my mad girl crush, as my girls would say, is Dr. Brene Brown. So that's the leadership model I'm trained in. And the piece that I connect with is what it's like for a leader to take true vulnerability, to walk in. And that saying of fail fast, fail often. And that's really accepted in like corporate culture. But man, if you had told me that clinically, I'm like, what? Fail fast, fail often? Are you freaking nuts? This is someone's life. But in a system, we are asking people who've been doing the same thing for 300 years to take major risks today of paradigm shifts. And that takes a leader who's willing to stand up and fall on their face repeatedly. And in Brené's language, resilience is called wholeheartedness. And I teach the Rising Strong curriculum. But in that, it's like the physics of vulnerability is not if you fail, it's when you fail. Mm-hmm. And how do you pull? So it is very hard. So you walk into organizations and they're like, I want to be like innovative and push the edge. And then you say, great, you're going to fail a lot and have to be really vulnerable and talk about your feelings. Yeah. No, I don't want to do that part.
It's not fun. It's
painful. No, I don't want to get messy or like make this emotional. I'm like, okay, then you can't do the whole innovative. So I guess that's my experience in that some of my clinical skills really help me, but it's really about the power of helping leaders create that space for others. Yeah. And it's a hard place to be for leaders. They're scared.
Well, and I think your point was well taken in my career is that, you know, I had to have like 3 years of graduate school to call myself a therapist. 6 months into my career, for some stupid reason, somebody promoted me something called a supervisor, and I got zero training, like none. Yeah. And it's like, you know, and I think therapy is an incredibly complex skill. And so there's no demeaning being done here when I say what I say next is leading a team in a helping organization where trauma either wakes up there in a 24/7 facility or walks through the door every day. Is some of the most complex work I think you can do. And there's not really a whole lot of books out there that says, here's what it means to be a manager, a leader, a supervisor. I mean, those alone are probably 3 volumes that need to be written about how you do that in the face of vicarious and secondary trauma. And I think it's just to recognize that would be a huge first step for our industries is, hey, maybe we don't know everything just because someone saw potential in us at some point, or we were around long enough to get promoted.
Well, and I think about the value of just the 3 of us talking right now, because the other thing I see in our field is our previous Secretary of State of Health in Virginia was Secretary Hazel, who had a huge impact on me. But he used to say we live in silos of excellence. So the other thing that happens is I am not allowed to share with you if I'm struggling, because I can't look like I'm struggling in front of you. And so what is the first thing then? Like in clinical, I'm taught work in Bowen's family system. We've got to change the system. But now we've created an organizational system that is taught, do not share if you're down. Do not show the data. Do not talk about it. Hide it, bury it, get better quietly. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got to teach you transparency, and it's threatening.
Yeah.
And I see a huge parallel process that happens, and we should do something about when a behavior analyst says parallel process. I should get some credit for that, really. for using
Episode what, 47, 48? Yeah.
I think that's an example of operant conditioning.
Well, there's that great story about that.
That is. Are you a convert?
One day I was talking to a pretty high-ranking clinical director within a large behavioral health system. He was in Florida, and I'd been talking for a couple of hours, and I'd been using the word parallel process, talking about organizational systems. And he said at the end of it, I said, "Is there any feedback? Like any questions?" And he goes, I spent my whole career hearing that behavior analysts were not clinicians. I know it's not true anymore because you use parallel process."
Oh, wow. You broke the silo.
That's right. That's right.
Well, Curt, I wonder, could you, because I'm sure not all of our listeners have heard that term before. And I think that really, as I want to shift us into resiliency, but I love what we're doing with leadership, because I think this ties in to the whole equation we're talking about. But let's define that term, because I'd love to get Allison's thoughts on this, both how resiliency of leadership and staff is a key part in helping our clients, students, and patients develop their own resiliency as well.
So the pattern I see, this is before I got off on a tangent, which that happens. One of the things that I think that we're kind of describing here at the leadership level are that feelings of inadequacy are really scary. Mm-hmm. Right? And for people who are in leadership positions, right, and most of people who are clinically trained have to have a graduate degree, which is a very small portion of the population. Right? That's about 8% of the entire population.
Wow, I didn't know that.
It's very small. So one of the things that people with graduate degrees are used to is being good at things. So when they're not good at things, I don't want to do it anymore. Like if I don't feel good at it, I don't like doing it.
It's true.
So that becomes when you go from being a clinician to being a leader, and it's not the job that you thought that it was. There's failure there, and I don't feel good at it. And so that starts to generate a lot of risk aversion. Okay. And I think the parallel that we have is that children who have been through adverse childhood experiences have problems dealing with their world successfully, right? The symptoms that got generated during the exposure to ACEs were there to manage being a part of a very stressful experience. And then when it's over and you don't need those symptoms anymore, they persist. And that's where we get a diagnosis from. Right. So then you get failure happening over and over and over again for that child who's exhibiting symptoms that help them to survive successfully in one situation, but it's not useful in another one. Right. So they come with a lot of feelings of failure and a lot of feelings of inadequacy. And so that starts to parallel up, like when they feel like they're failing, then the teacher in the classroom who's trying to help them and can't help them feels like a failure. They go to their boss and they make their boss feel like a failure because their boss can't help them. And then that level goes to the next level. So it all just goes up. And the trick is passing that affect and that feeling of inadequacy back down through the organization that doesn't make it worse. Right. And that ties right into resiliency, right? That for me, that's the leap right into how do we develop organizational practices that are aware of that process of feelings of inadequacy moving up the chain of the organization. Absolutely. And not send them back down so that we make people feel worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I was thinking, I might have taken your question, Matt, a little different. I was thinking if the viewers wanted to understand a little bit about what ABA was, and I may have, but I just would say that one of the values for me of ABA is I definitely didn't come from that side of the camp. But then I ended up in a PhD program, which is all about data. But the value of me working alongside people is they're pattern experts. I mean, that to me is kind of figuring out, and I see that exact pattern. And so what started happening at systems work is, are we looking at the data? Are we looking at the change? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting we're going to get a different result. And so what is it? And I agree with you. Some of the models of trauma-informed care say you come from a place of fear or from a place of love, right? And so it is that what happens. And so again, I go back to a training I did yesterday in a school system I absolutely adore. It's Hanover Schools in Virginia. He's been working with me for 3 years, and it was the Leadership Summit. And the slide I showed them this pyramid of if we're trying to change the child's behavior. So what the school's judged on is academic success, right? So that's where their scores come. That's where their pressure is. And so what I showed them is, okay, so you've got social determinants of health. And based on how that goes, then that actually kind of changes their ability to have relationships. They need positive relationships with peers and authority figures. If they've got that healthy relationship, then they can actually possibly engage in learning positive behaviors. If they can engage in positive behaviors, they can engage academically. And if they can engage academically, they'll be successful in academics, right? So we're scoring you on the 6th level, right? And we have kids that are on the 1st and 2nd level. We give you no credit for that, nor do we tell you it's important. And then underneath social determinants of health is the organizational self. Because if the organization's not healthy, exactly like you said. And so the fear comes is I've got a Department of Education that's grading me on standards of learning, and you're telling me to care about relationships and feelings, and I am terrified that if I invest in this, I'm going to lose my job. So then what I was saying to the leaders is I need you to take the risk to create the safety to say, no, forget that stuff, huge risk, and say, I want you to focus on this. And then what is the data I need to connect at these lower pyramid levels to know that that is creating change. And then I gave them models for that. So I think that's really important. And it takes a special kind of leader to think out of the box and say, I'm willing to take the hits because I'm going to stand up and look at the data and say, I'm afraid and I'm going to do it anyway. And that means you get to be afraid and do it anyway.
Yeah, and there's certainly levels of interventions, right, that have to be matched up. So let's take your example of you get graded on academic scores. And so the grading of academic scores is a way of applying a motivational intervention to improving academic performance, right? But if the skills aren't already there for academic performance to happen, you can motivate all day long and it doesn't make any difference.
Beautiful. You just said it so much more simply than me. Yes, that's exactly.
There's a mismatch between intervention and the problem.
Right. And so then what's happening is the teachers are feeling like failures. And what's happening is what they describe as in my classroom, I'm totally solely responsible for these 30 bodies. And now what I'm doing is offloading my hurt on them a lot of times because I can't get them. I went back to Dr. Ross Green's work of collaborative problem solving and plan A, plan B, plan C, right? And so, he asks the question, do kids do well when they want to, or do kids do well when they can? And many of them are like, well, they do well when they want to. And I said, but what does that do to you as a teacher? It makes you force them to do something. I said, how many people as a parent or as a teacher have been successful at making a kid do what they weren't ready to do? And they were like, none of us. And I'm like, so we gotta let that go. We gotta start where the kid is. Right? Yeah,
there's only a band of really kind of skill level and ability mismatch that motivation can make a difference in. And if you're beyond that band, motivation is not going to be what's going to do it. It's a different kind of problem.
Absolutely.
We see this with positive behavior intervention and support programs.
And that's actually what we're going into. Yes.
Yeah. So that's a motivational intervention.
Right.
I do this a lot in Colorado. They're called facility schools.
Okay.
It's an out of school placement basically, and it's its own district. So there's a state district for facility schools, but they're all the kids that really kind of failed out of public school. Right. So we'll do positive behavior intervention supports in facility schools as part of evidence-based practice.
Right.
But it's not bad. It's just that it's a motivational intervention.
So
we'll go in there and I'll say, okay, so we know from the evidence base that PBS works for about 80% of the kids in a public school setting. Our problem is that ain't none of those 80% here. This is all the ones that aren't here. They're all over there in that public school. This is all the kids that didn't work for.
Right.
So what we have to do is take our positive behavior intervention and support system and shift it developmentally so that then we're matched up with the right developmental level, and then a motivational intervention will work all day long.
Yeah.
It's really great. You just have to shift the skill level down.
Yep. And
I'd love to interject a question here to both of you because because one of the things that I really think we've missed historically, and I think we're talking about it here, is we expect folks, and I think this in many ways fails with any human being to some extent, but we're expecting folks with the high adverse childhood experience scores coming out of trauma. I see this both in school systems, but also my work in homelessness and the adult system, the criminal justice system as well. It's like, hey, if we just make their life painful enough, they'll become motivated and change behavior. I mean, and you still see this at a policy level. HUD, for example, let's raise rents 20%. That's going to motivate people. No, we've got years of evidence to show that that's ridiculous. It'll just create more homelessness. And so I wonder, as we think about the relationship, because this is, I think I'm hearing with both of your conversations here, and it's always fun to get Curt's language in here as well.
It is.
What do you see as the relationship between resiliency and motivation?
Yeah. I love because I felt like, and I feel like we're talking about resiliency, and one, I need to own that I think resiliency is actually the wrong word. I think it's the language we have, but there's a really interesting work going on in California right now that was part of the MARC community, Mobilizing Active Resilient Communities. It was part of RISE in Richmond, California, and their work there, what they learned is, why is it that, because one of the simplest definitions of resiliency is bouncing back, right? And it's why are we saying that we're teaching people how to bounce back? They've already bounced back. They survived. So
sometimes every morning, every day, 2 or 3 times a day.
So it's actually pretty disempowering to pick that word. And so the word that they're starting to create is this bounce forward, is I want more than to survive, I want to thrive. And then Washington uses the word flourish. So, but again, I just had this conversation in Iowa, but resilience is the word we've got, right? It's taken a long time to grab that word, but I just think that's an important thing to know. But when you talk about this relationship between motivation and resilience, where my brain was going when you talked and Curt talked was, to me, what resiliency is about is replacement coping behaviors, right? So I think you nailed it, Curt, is like what it's about is I learned how to, so like in my lived experience, I learned if I was super aggressive, people stopped putting their hands on me. It was extremely effective, right? But then it was not effective when I went into other environments like school and community. So now I got a diagnosis of like conduct disorder versus it was really effective to survive. So what I need is another way to feel safe, to communicate feeling unsafe, to communicate I don't like what you're doing. And that's my replacement coping behavior. And to me, that's the essence of resilience. So to me, resilience is like a big umbrella that a lot of things fall under, but in essence is me building the things that help me move to learn how to cope effectively in my current moment. A huge component of that is my motivation, I think at the right intervention level that Curt was talking about. So I've got to be, if I'm in pre-contemplation, right, then I'm not really sure I want to try on this new coping behavior, right? Because for me also, like I eat carbs all day long. I don't think I'd be good for the whole like rectal thing that you're talking about earlier. I'm working on a better digestive system, right? But
I don't want competition. I want to get a monopoly. I think I can fill the need.
I will let you corner that market, man.
I'm with you, Curt. I need a lot of activia, but yogurt. But I think if I look at that as having ACE, it's just my own lived experience. So that was a negative coping mechanism. Carbs is going to make you feel better when it actually doesn't. So now I've got to learn, well, actually, I've got in dialectical behavior therapy, we call it opposite action, right? Yeah. So now I've got to learn to try a walk, and I've got to build my neurons that walk is actually going to help me cope differently than that food. And so to me, I've got to build my motivation to get to the point that I start trying to walk enough that my Millennium sheath starts building up, where I start to be able to let go of the carbs and grab the walk, if that makes sense.
Yep. And one of the concepts we talk about is in the behavioral world, we call those pivotal responses. That they're so important. We also call them behavioral cusps, like you're on the cusp of something. If you teach one specific thing, language is one of them, very common, and especially in people on the spectrum. Right? We teach kids how to ask for things, and that's much lower effort than I have to throw a tantrum to get it. So it's likely to be really kind of contacting positive contingencies in its environment. So if I ask my mom, can I have a cup of water, instead of throwing a tantrum and crying on the floor until she figures out that water is what I want, way easier for me to get what I want. So it starts to really generate a lot of change. So when you look, I love what you said about bouncing forward. I think that's so important when we think about how do we coach employees? How do we coach clinicians on how to stay focused on a positive vision of the future, even when your client can't? I think that's part of what your job is. And so us remaining resilient in that sense, the great sense of it, is to help people with a positive future vision when sometimes they can't do that. And we got to do that a little bit for them.
So now Matt, you might have to redirect me, but one thing that I just thought of when you said that was, and Matt, you got to attend, I've been working the last couple of years on a resilience coping tool to help people think outside of the clinical world in a large degree. But when you were just, and I may have just lost it, but when you were just talking about helping them, I lost it. What was the last thing you just said? Do you remember?
I think it was around fecal implants.
No, it was definitely not. Oh, you were talking about staff holding the hope. Okay,
right.
So
yes.
Right. That's right. So the staff. So I think what's powerful is, so in this resilience coping tool, I've taken some of assets, like 42 assets while came up, of skills, right, that we want resilient kids to have, and resilient adults too. And when I started using it again in schools, and I don't mean to pick on schools, my brain's in schools right now because it's across all systems. But one of the things we realized was really important is we set everybody working with that kid in the same room, which by the way is still a phenomenal act in some places, to have all the people that touch a child's life in the same room having the same conversation. But when we talked, I would say, what do you like about this kid? What's the hope? What do they do well? And they'd be like, he's super annoying. And I'm like, okay, that's not quite a resilience. I go for persistence.
You're like, close.
But, yes.
That's close to positive.
What I found is I spent 15 minutes of coaching for them to remember what they hoped for this child.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, if you've lost it, then I promise the kid can't get there.
Right.
And so I think part of this is about, going back to our leadership conversation, resilient coaching, of having those moments. I was lucky to always have clinical supervision, and it didn't matter how many years I've been doing clinical practice. I needed clinical supervision alone. But we have a lot of professionals out there that don't have that. They don't have that moment to talk about it. And so they've got to hold that, I see what you can build. And some of our folks are losing that. And so it's not a shock to me that the kids can't get somewhere we don't see them being.
Yeah.
Well, Will, and I mean, I'm amazed, and this doesn't make me popular. I need to package this in a pretty box, but I mean, I think my wife's a first grade teacher. She gets an hour of supervision a year. And that's a principal coming into her classroom and doing an observation, and I'm doing air quotes. Not that her principal is bad by it, but that's sort of the model is, we're going to see how you're doing in the classroom. The other thing that's appalling to me is, and I do a lot of work with healthcare for the homeless clinics. So clinics serving individuals with high rates of HIV addiction. And the bottom line is they're experiencing homelessness. And these medical providers, a lot of times physicians that are some of the most brilliant medical providers, I would, if you gave me a choice, hey, you can go see this person at the Mayo Clinic or Healthcare for the Homeless Clinic, I'd go to Healthcare for the Homeless Clinic every time, because they get outcomes with people living on the street, not people flying in from Saudi Arabia to get care with all the resources in the world. But we don't give these physicians any supervision either. And there's this whole group in the helping professions, whether we call that education, a lot of folks I know in criminal justice, that don't have any meaningful supervision. And supervision often means I did something wrong. And maybe I'm lucky enough to have a team meeting where we can talk about deeper issues. But I would even say that in many ways is the exception and not the rule. So, I mean, I just wondered, is there, and why I'm unpopular sometimes, and when people call me in to talk about leadership, is I don't know how you run that clinic. I don't know how you run an effective school without some strategic individual, group is okay, but individual supervision where it's at least at a biweekly basis. Because even my wife teaches at in Boulder, Colorado, which is a very wealthy community. You know, there's psychologically damaging stuff that she brings home on a weekly basis. And so it's like, how, you know, if we have these systems built on, you know, hey, go do your job. And, you know, if you really have a problem, come see me, because I have an open door policy, which I'm really tired of that term.
You started on that, yeah.
But my question to both of you is, can we do this work without individual support? And I won't even use supervision. I'll just use support. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have a big hell no to that, but I feel strongly.
Yeah.
But I'm also about, like, organizationally starting where the client is, but I couldn't concur more, is that, you know, when I started watching, even we had something called in-home services here. These were bachelor level people, but they were working with some of the most vulnerable clients having the most difficult time. And because they were bachelors and not clinicians, they were getting supervision once every other month on some of the hard, and I'm just like, what the heck? You know, and then we have recovery specialists who, many of them don't get supervision at all once they're, you know, and so I don't, and then what I feel bad about for them as professionals, they get hung out to dry for not being effective. So one of the things that makes me unpopular and popular is and this is probably not a politically correct term, but I no longer like to do one-for trainings, which is often just showing up once, because what I find is I get people really excited and then I walk away, and a couple people will take a couple things and do it, but then they just feel like excited for a day and nothing changes. Yeah. And I've decided at this point in my life, post 40, when I am less politically correct, that I will go if there's a plan. Doesn't have to be me. But I want to plan, because I've really become a place in this model where I want to come out and do the general. Then I want to have a plan of who needs what level of training beyond that, professional development pathways. And then beyond that, who's your direct supervisor? You could have a different administrative supervisor than the person that helps you process what you're doing at your work. And then I am now a huge advocate of peer-to-peer coaching models, and really using the coaching model and having that year-long. I'm having to start it monthly in places because it's yearly, and so we're increasing it and then trying to get it, I agree with you, bi-weekly. But it is a huge shift of resources. It is a huge shift of mindset. And I really believe that the majority of my time now I spend in technical assistance, not training, because that is where I believe it needs to be, is creating sustainability, because I don't know how we get these systems successful if they don't figure out the day-to-day stuff. Yeah. Not just me who flies in for a day and says, yeah, these are some great models that you can use, and flies out. That to me, that's not a good service to the systems I come to.
Absolutely. Curt, let me add something to I want to get your opinion on this, but you brought up parallel processes. So I'm obviously going to run with that for the next month and a half on this podcast.
I got to get you to say the term interlocking contingencies. That's how
good luck. Good luck.
Parallel process in behavioral.
Good luck on that one. But I want to throw to you, because on our podcast, every episode, and even this episode, and I know Allison supports this 100%, it's about the relationship. And so I wonder, from a systems thinker, is, you know, what's your thought about, we ask people, again, number one driver of outcomes usually is the quality of the relationship in most studies. And yet, how do you think the parallel process works, and what should we think about from a leadership or a supervisory or even a staff position about, does the quality of the relationship within the organization predict the quality of the relationship with the client, student, patient? I'd love to get your systems thinking on sort of that aspect of it.
I think there are a couple of levels around the supervision question that are important to ask. So the first one that you guys were just alluding to, which is so important, is the first level, which is it has to happen.
Yeah.
There's got to be some level of it happening, and then the second level is what happens when it happens. Right. So that's a different level, right? That you don't ask that question unless you answer the first question.
Right.
So if it's happening, then great. Now we get to go on to the second question, which is what is happening in that time? Yeah. And that's, I think, an equally important question. In my experience, what I have seen is that even if supervision happens, sometimes if what happens in that supervision isn't productive, it's not helpful. It's actually harmful.
Yeah.
So there's a level there of understanding how to be a supervisor that is really important. I'll pull a little from my own personal experience about how I had to learn how to use supervision effectively. I did not learn that until I was 40 years old. I spent that much time going to supervision, trying to prove to every supervisor I ever had that I knew what I was talking about. That was the way I thought about supervision, right? Until I started learning, wait a minute, I just need to go. And sometimes I got somebody with more experience than I do, and I need to go listen, or I need to go get another person's perspective. And it changed my utilization of supervision. And that changed my learning happened way differently then. I was much more receptive to learning when I wasn't just always trying to prove that I knew what I was talking about all the time. So I think there's that second question, right? And I think that kind of gets to your question of the quality of the relationship is what happens once we've answered the first question of supervision needs to happen. Then we have to talk about what are we going to do in that time. Certainly one of my favorite approaches to developing a supervision structure is to think about the balance between there's a part of the supervision which is I need to talk to somebody about how difficult this job is and what the impact that this job is having on me. And that's one purpose. And the other purpose is I need to learn something so that when I get into that situation next time, I have a new skill or I have a new way to understand what I just saw and what just happened to me. So there's a learning part of it, and then there's a kind of a holding part. Yeah. And that takes a pretty dynamic supervisor to know how do you balance those two things. And again, as a supervisor, you learn that by screwing it up a lot and really kind of going, well, I kind of missed the mark on that one. And you learn how to do it a little bit better next time.
Well, I think it exemplifies, and I'm not sure, I think this model really works if you've got the right people. And I usually, from a systems perspective, don't like to create systems based on, hey, you've got to find the exact right fit for this work. But I know in a lot of HIV organizations, and I've seen this in other places, you have clinical supervision and administrative supervision, and those are actually two different people. And I think, while again, I've seen that really work well if you have a really good fit between those two supervisors, I've also seen it really be harmful when those two people, if those two people don't get along, your staff become at best burned out, at worst traumatized, because they're kind of in a mom, dad, mom war going on, which is ugly. But I think just the fact that we're in a field where we may say we need something like clinical supervision, I think at least gives language to the intensity of the work and really shows how hard this is. And you know, my reaction to being promoted into supervisor and not seeing any good role models necessarily around, even though I had some good supervisors, but they were like, I didn't see a whole lot of great organizations around. And I kind of had this aspiration at one point to lead those organizations. And, you know, it was just a real powerful experience to go into an MBA program in healthcare. And, you know, I would ask all these world-class professors in this program that I was in, is like, you know, and I was working with a school. I know Curt's familiar with the school that I worked with you know, highly violent kids with learning disabilities and mental health issues. And I would go in and, okay, this kid's sending, you know, a half dozen staff to emergent care every week. How do I manage that while keeping morale high? And they just freeze. Like they would have the freeze response. Yes. You know, I had a smear at the time, and I won't get the fecals on my mind for some reason, but you know, we would have to go in and clean up the mess. And I unfortunately made the statement is I wouldn't ask my staff to do anything I wouldn't do myself. So to keep people from quitting, I would have to go into this quiet room and clean up the mess every day. And I would ask them these questions: how do we keep, you know, motivation high when we're dealing with this? And they just kind of drop. There were no good answers even at the top thing. So even though that doesn't demotivate me, actually, it's like, okay, we've got to figure this out. And that's highly motivating for me. I think also it shows just the intensity of the work that we do. And I think it's important to at least recognize.
Yeah, and I think one other thing, I just want to answer the systems question. I was really, because I was thinking about what you said, Curt, about 40. I was really lucky in my career, and probably didn't know it then. And again, I had this weird, like, what is it called? It's not Survivor. It's Imposter Syndrome thing that happens to me a lot of times. So like I ended up being at one point in my career the vice president of 35 states clinical operations, which is freaking crazy. The Imposter Syndrome is I was a 13-year-old that was locked up, and now I'm supposed to help 35 states figure out how to work with kids. So it was serious. Like, do you know who you hired? No, I won't tell you. So, but one of the things that happened in that is we caught a contract in Tennessee, and there was a small project happening with Vanderbilt to look at supervision. And we said, wow, could we do it across all of our states? So we did an NIH grant with Vanderbilt led by Dr. Lynn Bickman for 10 years. And we asked a couple of questions. We asked, which really goes to your number 2, Curt, of what happens in that moment. So the question we asked is, does feedback even matter? Does supervision even matter? Do we even know that what happens in that room makes a difference? And so we did trials of where people got no feedback. Not that they didn't get supervision, but we designed a way to actually track data, and then quarterly and then weekly, monthly. And basically what we did is we took the common factors model. If people are familiar with that therapeutically. So it's the idea that, therapeutic alliance and rupture matter beyond any evidence-based practice, that setting expectations matters, that motivation matters, right? That collaborative treatment planning matters. So they took that forum and they really worked to take, it was funny, we sat down because we were thinking about supervision, and they're like, we want all your clients to fill out these 300 items every week. And we just laughed, right? Because that's what happens with academics. They have no idea what happens in the subset. So we got it down to these things were like 3 and 4 psychometrically tested. And so what happened is a group of people got feedback every week therapeutically, collateral data from the client, from the family, and from what you thought was happening as the clinician. And you got regularly weekly feedback on some of these to look at what was actually changing with how we see internalizing, externalizing behaviors, how we see rupture and therapeutic alliance. So we got all this data, but what was wild is what we were looking at is the supervisor would get this data, because as a supervisor, what I found is I am completely reliant on you telling me what you want to talk about. And a lot of times I was the same way. I want you to think I'm a really good clinician, so I'm going to tell you everything I think I'm doing well and not talk about what I'm not sure about to learn. So what was fascinating, and I'm making this long because it was 10 years, but what was fascinating is what we learned over 10 years is that people that got feedback every week and people that had supervisors that looked at that feedback and brought it into supervision and helped ask questions about what can we learn from this, from basically single system design, and let's try this and look at what we get back. Not only the kids got better faster, the enjoyment, the compassion satisfaction of the clinicians got faster, but it was terrifying to clinicians because as clinicians, and I can say this because I'm one, we have this magical art that you can't capture in data. Yeah, so no, don't measure me, right? Because you won't get the magic. And I have some of that love in me, but we got to capture it, right? And so by capturing it, lets you talk about it and see something else. But they were worried they'd become technicians. And instead, what happened is once they learned it, they got so excited to see the feedback because now I know where I'm going.
Yep.
And even if I'm bombing out, now I know what to do. And as a supervisor, now I know how to help. So I guess what I'm saying is I still, even though that study was completed like 8 years ago, when I go into behavioral health entities, it is sad to me where we are in clinical supervision, and we're the ones that I feel like have valued this for a long time in our industry. So it's not surprising to me that we're where we are in other human systems. And I think we've really got to think about that. And that is so funny. I feel like we haven't talked about resiliency, but we have.
Yeah.
But to me, that's a huge part of resiliency is questioning our own systems and how we get feedback.
Absolutely. And I think I was going to ask you to give us a piece of wisdom to go out on, and I think you just did. But how, Allison, if our folks want to learn more about you, I'm going to put your TED Talk, which I thought was great. And one of the things I took away is it was a brilliant TED Talk. And Allison's got the coolest pants.
I know, right? That was great.
I am so jealous. Like, I want those
I
pants.
bought you a pair of white pants.
That's awesome.
I really want to pull that off. I really do. 6'7" though, my waist guy. I really want to.
Really
You
long.
just gotta watch it for the pants, and I promise you'll learn something too. They're the coolest pants ever. But how else could people learn more about you, get in contact with you, learn more about your work?
So the name of my business is Integration Solutions. So the website is integrationsolutions.org, and that really comes from the Latin root integrate. So it's to make whole, to think about how to integrate our lives. And so you can hit me up there. I am working at entering the social media world. So I'm working at some of those angles as well. Would love you to check me out there. But you can learn a lot about what I do. And I love people sending me emails of like, did you know about? Because the way that I stay excited about this field is meeting people like you, Matt, and you, Curt, that get me excited, you know, and I'm a big believer in sharing knowledge. So yeah, so I'd love to hear from people, and if I can ever be of help, let me know.
Awesome. Well, I've got the link to your integration solutions on the show notes. Also, if you're interested more in fecal donations, the biological mind link is up there. Hopefully I didn't gross anybody out and they missed this episode because what my bright shiny object of the week was. I'll also put Allison's TED Talk up there. Allison, thank you so much. I knew this was going to be a great discussion, and I imagine we'll be reaching out. Curt and I are we're going to integrate more and more leadership stuff in that piece, and I'd love to have you back to join that conversation with us in the future. You were a great guest, and really appreciate your time and energy.
Thank you so much. It's been awesome talking with you, gentlemen.
Awesome. Well, as always, thank you everybody for joining us. Next week, I want to throw out a topic of I know Curt and Jerry has mentioned serve and return communication, and I think that would make a really great episode for us. So next week for episode 49, we'll hit that, and we're getting close to a 1-year anniversary, Curt, and I just want to throw it out there for any of our audience. Let us know what you'd like us to do for episode 52. If you got any suggestions, if there's people in the Colorado area that would even like to see maybe even a live show, we've been kicking that around. But we'd love to get an audience there if anybody's interested in that. So if you have any thoughts, again, traumainformedlens.org, you can find all the show notes there. You can also put comments that we read. So if you want to throw a comment of what you'd like to see us do for our 1-year anniversary, otherwise I will make us talk about quantum physics. So there's a carrot and a stick there for us. It's either going to be quantum physics or you're going to help guide us to what we talk about. So, and if you want to talk about quantum physics, you can put that on there too, because it'll happen at some point. So, Allison, again, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your work, your passion. Just the little time I've known you, learned so much and drawn inspiration from your work. And Curt, as always, enjoyed it. So everybody have a great week. We'll see you next week for a little serve and return talk. So thanks, everybody.
Take care.